The country vicarage stood at the soft southern edge of a Wiltshire village, a low, honey-colored house with climbing roses already opening their first pale faces to the spring air. And on the morning the young woman was to leave for her new post, the air was so still that the bees making their slow rounds through the lavender beneath the parlor window seemed to be the only thing in the world that hurried. She was 23, the middle of the vicar's 3 daughters, and her name had been carried in a careful letter through 3 counties and back again until it had settled, neatly written, upon a sheet of cream notepaper, folded inside a small envelope sealed with dark green wax. The envelope had arrived a fortnight ago. The letter inside had been brief and exceedingly courteous. A widowed gentleman of the Cotswolds, whose name appeared at the foot in a quiet, measured hand, requested the favor of her instruction at the pianoforte for his only daughter, 8 years of age, for an initial period of 3 months, with a small private apartment in the east wing of his country house, a modest stipend, and the kind hospitality of his table at supper. Her father had read it twice, set it down upon the breakfast cloth, and looking up at her over the rim of his old spectacles, had said only, "My dear, I think you must go." Now she stood in the small bedroom she had shared, in childhood, with her elder sister, and pressed the lid of a worn leather trunk down against the soft folds of 3 muslin day dresses, 2 evening gowns, a white shawl, a pair of cream silk gloves wrapped carefully in tissue, and a small velvet box that held an ivory cameo on a fine ribbon, given to her at 14 when her mother had still been living. Her hair was pinned up simply with a single pale blue silk ribbon at the nape of her neck. The morning light through the small leaded window fell across her face in a soft, slow, kindly way, the way light falls in country houses on quiet days, and she stood there a long moment with her hand upon the closed lid, listening to the bees and to the doves murmuring in the eaves, and she thought that perhaps she might never again wake to so familiar a sound. Her father came up the stairs presently with the slow, careful step of a man whose knees had begun in the last year to remind him of his age. He carried in his hands a slim, worn music score, the cover faded to a dove gray, the corners softened by long years of use, and he stood at the threshold of the room and looked at her with the quiet pride of a man who has loved his children to the very edge of his ability to express it. "This," he said gently, "was your mother's. She used to play it on summer evenings when you were very small. I think it ought to go with you." She took the score in her gloved hands and pressed it once, gently, against the front of her pale blue muslin day dress, as though it were a small living thing. She did not weep. She had been brought up not to weep at partings if she could help it, for her mother had taught her, before everything else, that the truest courage was the courage to be calm in the doorway. But her eyes, which were large and warm and gray-blue, lifted to her father's, and he saw in them what he had perhaps already known, that she was a young woman now, and that the world, gentle as it was about to take her from him for a season. The post-chaise that came for her at 9 was a hired thing, modest but clean, drawn by 2 patient bays, and the driver lifted his hat to her with country courtesy as he handed her up. Her father stood at the gate. Her 2 sisters, the elder married already, and visiting from Salisbury, the younger only 16 and very freckled, stood beside him. The roses on the gatepost nodded once in the soft April breeze. The vicar said something quiet that only she heard, and she nodded, and she folded her gloved hands very carefully upon the worn music score in her lap, and the chaise moved off down the lane. The road to the Cotswolds was a slow road in 1815, threaded with hawthorn just coming into its first foam of white blossom, and the post chaise rocked her gently for the better part of 2 days. with one quiet night spent at a small inn in a market town she had never seen before, where she ate a piece of cold ham and a slice of bread and butter at a corner table, and went up early to a clean, low-ceilinged room and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a young woman whose courage was holding fast against the unfamiliar. By the second afternoon, the country had changed about her. The hedges had grown lower, the fields wider, the stone of the cottages and barns had warmed into a soft honey color she had only read about in books, and at last, as the long blue afternoon began to thin into evening, the chaise turned in between two tall gate piers, each one capped with a stone urn, and entered the avenue of beeches that ran up to Avenstone Park. The beeches were old and tall, and not yet in full leaf, and the late sunlight came down in slow, soft patches between their pale gray trunks, and beyond them, when the avenue opened, she saw the house for the first time, and she drew in a small, quiet breath. Avenstone Park was not a vast house, nor a grand one in the showy modern manner, but it was a house that knew its own age and its own grace. It was built of the warm Cotswold stone that the local quarries had been giving up since before the Tudors, and it stood low and long and dignified at the head of a sweep of mown grass, with tall sash windows giving back the soft pink of the western sky. The chaise drew up at the steps. A gray-haired butler, plainly and properly dressed, came down to receive her. She was handed out, her trunk was lifted, and she was shown through a stone-floored hall with a great clock ticking slowly against one wall and a vase of the season's first lilac upon a side table, into a small, paneled morning room where a fire had been lit against the soft chill of the spring evening, and she was given a cup of tea. It was there, with the cup still warm between her gloved fingers, that she met her new employer for the first time. He came in quietly. She had not heard him in the corridor. He was tall, 6 feet, she thought, perhaps an inch beyond, and lean, and held himself upright in the way of men who have ridden much and grieved without complaint. His hair was dark brown, brushed neatly back from a high forehead. His jaw was fine and Roman, with the faint, soft shadow of stubble at the day's end. His eyes, when they met hers, were gray-blue and very kind. He wore a dark charcoal coat over a cream waistcoat, a white cravat tied without ostentation, and the polished riding boots of a man who has been out about his land that afternoon. He bowed to her, gravely and gently, and she rose and curtsied in the modest way her mother had taught her, and he said, in a voice that was low and very even, that he was glad she had come, that he hoped her journey had not been too tiring, and that his daughter had been waiting for her arrival with a quietness that he could only describe as almost unbearable patience. She smiled at that, very small. He did not smile in return, not quite, but something at the corner of his mouth softened, and she understood at once that this was a house where smiles were a careful currency, and were given when they were truly meant. The little girl came in then, holding the butler's hand. She was 8, slender, with soft strawberry blonde hair tied back in 2 pale blue ribbons, and hazel eyes that took in the visitor with the grave thoroughness of a child who has decided in advance that she will be polite. She wore a soft pale blue child's frock with a white sash, white silk slippers upon her small feet. She curtsied quite properly. She said, in the clear, unhurried voice of a country child, that she was very pleased to make the lady's acquaintance, and she hoped the lady was not too tired for supper. The young woman crouched down at once, very gently, her gloves brushing the carpet, and said that she was not tired at all, and that she very much hoped they should be friends. The little girl considered this with great seriousness, and then nodded, and then, only then, allowed a small, unmistakable smile to begin at one corner of her mouth. So began the first quiet evening at Avenstone Park, and so began 3 months that would alter the course of 3 small lives without ever once raising its voice. Supper that night was taken in the morning room rather than in the formal dining room, for the morning room faced east and held the last of the soft pink evening light, and the Earl had thought it would feel less imposing for a young woman newly arrived. Cold ham, a dish of early peas in butter, fresh bread, and a small custard tart. The Earl asked her about her father's parish, about the roses on the vicarage gate, about whether she preferred Mozart or Haydn for a beginning student, and she answered him in her quiet, steady way, with her gloved hands folded in her lap, and her honey-blonde hair very neat in its single pale blue ribbon. The little girl ate very tidily. She watched the new lady. She did not interrupt. But twice, when she thought no one was looking, she lifted her hazel eyes and gave her father a small, careful glance, as if she were measuring the weather of his face, and twice she looked away again, content with what she had seen. When supper was over, the housekeeper, a soft, round woman of 50 with kind hands, took her up the broad oak staircase, along a long, quiet corridor, past doors of polished mahogany and walls hung with old portraits, and into a small private apartment in the east wing. There was a sitting room with a low fire already lit, a writing desk with fresh ink and clean paper, a small bedchamber with a 4-poster of plain white linen, and a window that looked out across the rose garden to the dim outline of the beech avenue beyond. Her trunk had already been carried up. Her traveling cloak had been hung carefully behind the door. She thanked the housekeeper. She closed the door. She stood at the window for a long while, watching the day fade out across the roses, and only when the first low star had appeared above the beeches did she allow herself, at last, to sit down upon the edge of the bed and let out a single slow breath. The first lesson took place the next morning. The morning room of Avenstone Park was the most graceful room in the house, low-ceilinged but full of soft eastern light, with 2 tall sash windows giving on to the formal garden, walls papered in a dove-gray pattern of small leaves, a marble fireplace surmounted by a gilt mirror, and, set against the inner wall, a polished walnut broadwood fortepiano of fine make and modest age. The young woman entered the room a little before 9, in a fresh pale blue muslin day dress with a white shawl about her shoulders, her honey-blonde hair newly pinned, and she stood for a long moment before the instrument with her gloved fingertips just touching the closed fall, listening to the room. She had played all her life. Her mother had taught her at 6, sitting beside her on the bench at the modest cottage piano in the parlor of the Wiltshire vicarage, and she had carried her mother's instruction with her ever since, the way one carries a small lamp through a long house. She knew, before she lifted the fall of the broadwood, that this was an instrument that had been loved and well kept, and she knew, too, before any word had been spoken to her of it, that it had not been played for some considerable time. There was a small, careful film of dust along the music rest. The candles in the brass sconces above the keyboard had not been newly trimmed. She did not lift the fall. Not yet. Instead, she turned, and there at the threshold stood the little girl, in her soft, pale blue frock and pale blue ribbons, holding in her hands a slim leather music case as though it were a small live bird. Behind the little girl, in the corridor, half-shadowed, with one hand resting lightly upon the doorframe, stood the Earl. He was not coming in. He had only, he said, after a small, steady pause, wished to bid them a good morning and to assure himself that the room was warm enough for the young lady's first lesson. The fire had been lit since 7. The room was perfectly warm. He bowed very faintly and stepped back into the corridor, and the young woman heard his even bootsteps move away down the stone passage toward the library, and she thought, without quite knowing why she thought it, that he had stood at that door rather longer than the asking required. She turned to the little girl and she smiled, and she said gently, "Shall we begin?" The first lesson was very small. She did not put the child to the keys at once. Instead, she sat beside her on the long, padded bench and lifted the fall carefully and let the little girl simply look at the keyboard, at the long, even row of white keys and the smaller black ones in their patient pairs and threes. She named the notes. She played with one ungloved finger, a soft, slow scale of C very quietly, the way one tells a sleeping child a story. The Broadwood, having been loved before, gave back the note with a clear, sweet patience, as though it were glad to be wakened. The little girl's hazel eyes opened a little wider. She said, in her unhurried voice, that the note had a color, and the young woman, who had thought the same thing at the same age, but had never known another child to think it, looked at her with a slow, soft surprise and asked her, very gently, "What color?" "Pale yellow," said the little girl. "Like butter on bread." The young woman laughed once, very quietly, and said that yes, that was exactly the color of C, and that they should be very good friends indeed. She was quite sure of it now. So the first lesson passed. Half an hour, no more. A few notes named, a few notes played. The little girl's small white hand laid once or twice upon the keys, with the young woman's gloved hand resting gently above it, guiding without pressing. At the end, the little girl curtsied. The young woman curtsied in return, smiling. The fall was lowered. The morning light upon the dove-gray wallpaper had grown a little stronger. In the corridor outside, perhaps 2 yards beyond the half-open door, the Earl was standing very still, with one hand resting upon the back of an old hall chair, and he was listening. He did not know himself how long he had been standing there. When the lesson finished, and the door opened wider, and the small, bright voice of his daughter reached him in fragments, pale yellow, like butter on bread, he stepped back swiftly into the library and closed the door, and he stood for a long moment with his hand against the cool oak panel, and his eyes were not quite as steady as he would have liked. He had not heard the Broadwood since the spring his wife had died. 4 years, that spring. He had not allowed himself to. There had been a piano tuner once a year out of duty to the instrument, and there had been the housekeeper's careful dustings, and there had been silence. A silence so long and so thick that he had almost forgotten there had ever been anything else. That morning, in the corridor, he had heard one slow, soft scale of C, and it had sounded, quite unaccountably, like pale yellow, like butter on bread. The lessons settled into a quiet pattern over the first weeks. 3 mornings a week, from 9 until 10. The young woman and the little girl met in the morning room. Sometimes the little girl was full of questions. Sometimes she was quietly tired and only wished to listen. The young woman never pressed her. She believed, having been taught by her mother in just this way, that music was a slow-growing thing, like a rose, and that one did not pull at the bud to make it open faster. By the end of the second week, the little girl had learned the names of all her notes and could find middle C without looking, and could play, with great careful concentration, a simple 8-bar exercise with both hands. By the end of the third week, she could play it without hesitation and was beginning a small, slow piece called The Robin in the Garden, a teaching piece the young woman had learned at the same age. And by the end of the fourth week, on a quiet Wednesday morning when the rain was falling so softly across the rose garden that one had to look twice to be sure it was raining at all, the Earl walked past the door of the morning room. He did not stop. He did not look in. He merely passed along the corridor at a measured, even pace, his polished black boots making their soft, regular sound upon the flagstones, and he disappeared in the direction of the library. The young woman noticed him. She did not look up. She kept her hand gentle above the little girl's hand, and her voice quiet, and she counted softly under her breath, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, as the little girl played her 4 notes carefully. Half an hour later, when the lesson ended and the young woman walked along the corridor herself toward the breakfast room for a late cup of tea, she observed, without remarking upon it, that the door of the library was ajar, and that within it the Earl was sitting at his writing desk with a book open before him, and that the book was not the one he had been reading at breakfast. He passed the door of the morning room twice more that week. By the second month, he passed it 3 times a week, and always at 5 minutes past 9, and always in the direction of the library, and always at the same measured, even pace. The housekeeper, who was a soft, round woman of 50, and missed very little that happened in the house, observed it. The butler observed it. The little girl, of course, observed it most of all. The little girl was 8 years old, and she was clever. She had loved her father with the deep, careful love that a young child gives to a parent who has carried her through grief, and she had observed, in the 4 years since her mother's death, that her father had not laughed aloud, not once, and had not played a note of music, not once, and had walked his estate with the quiet attentiveness of a man whose mind was always a little elsewhere. She had not minded. He had been kind to her every day of her remembered life, but she had wished, not in words, for she had not yet had words for it, that he might one day come back into the room. And now, in the soft late spring of her 9th year, she could feel him coming back. She did not say so. Instead, in her careful, unhurried way, she began very quietly to conspire. She asked the young woman one morning whether her father had used to play the pianoforte. The young woman, surprised, said she did not know. The little girl nodded gravely, as though this answer were precisely what she had expected, and said no more. 2 days later, after the lesson, she went very neatly into the library where her father was working at his desk, and stood at his elbow until he looked up and asked him, with the candor of small children, whether he had used to play. He looked at her for a long moment. The pen rested in his hand. The light through the library window was a soft, late spring green, filtered through new beech leaves. At length, he said, very quietly, that yes, he had used to play when her mother had been with them, that her mother had taught him, that he had not played since. The little girl considered this. Then she nodded and said in her clear, unhurried voice that she thought perhaps he might like to come and listen sometimes when the new lady was at her lessons with her, because the new lady was very kind, and the music was a pale yellow color, and it was nice to hear. He set down the pen. He put one hand upon the top of his daughter's small, strawberry blonde head, very gently, and he did not answer for a while. Then he said only that he would think about it, and that for now he was content to hear the music drift along the corridor, and that she was a very good girl. She accepted this. She curtsied. She went away, but it had been said. The thing had been spoken aloud between them, and a small, soft door, long closed, had been propped open by the small, careful hand of a child. The country spring eased into early summer. The roses in the formal garden began to open in earnest. First the pale climbers along the south wall of the house, then the deep velvety damasks in the old square beds at the center. Then, by the middle of June, every bush and bower, until the air itself across the lawn smelled faintly of warm petals. The young woman, who had grown up among country roses, took to walking in the garden in the half hour after each lesson, before her mid-morning bread and butter in the breakfast room. She wore her white shawl about her shoulders even on the warm days, for the Cotswold mornings still held a thread of cool. Her honey-blonde hair, in its single pale blue ribbon, caught the sunlight. The little girl, who was quietly devoted to her now, often ran out from the morning room to join her, and they would walk together down the gravel path between the damask roses, the child's small hand tucked into the young woman's gloved one. It was upon one such morning, in the second week of June, that the Earl met them in the garden by something that was perhaps not entirely chance. He had been walking the south lawn. He had a switch of hawthorn in his hand, a riding habit of dark blue, his polished boots only faintly dusty from the stable yard. He came around the corner of the old square box hedge at the same moment that the young woman and the little girl came up the path from the rose beds, and there was a small, quiet pause, and he bowed, and she curtsied, and the little girl beamed up at her father with a kind of careful delight she had been keeping tucked away for some weeks. He asked them, in his low, even voice, whether they had walked far. The young woman said, only as far as the dovecote and back. He nodded. He observed that the damask roses were particularly fine this year. The young woman said yes, they were quite extraordinary. There was a small silence. Then he asked, with a courtesy that did not quite hide the slight unsteadiness behind it, whether she would do him the great kindness of joining them at supper that evening in the morning room, rather than taking her tray in her sitting room, as had become her custom on quieter days. She said she would be very glad to. He bowed again. He walked on toward the stables. The little girl, when he was out of hearing, lifted her hazel eyes to her young teacher's face with the slow, careful triumph of a small general who had observed the success of a long campaign, and said only, in her clear, unhurried voice, "I am glad we are having supper together." Supper that evening was simple. A small dish of poached salmon from the river, peas again, fresh strawberries with cream, and a small pot of tea afterward. The morning room held the long, gentle gold of a midsummer evening. The Earl spoke a little of his land, of the new tenant on the home farm, of a hawk he had seen above the south meadow that afternoon. The young woman spoke a little of her father's parish, of her mother who had taught her music, of the worn dove-gray score that had traveled with her in her trunk. The little girl listened very carefully, holding her spoon properly, and at the end of supper she asked, with great politeness, whether she might be excused to fetch a book, and being told yes, slipped down from her chair and went away into the library. The two adults were alone in the morning room for perhaps 3/4 of an hour after that. The light went from gold to pale rose to soft lilac. Neither rose to ring for candles. They spoke quietly. The young woman folded her gloved hands in her lap. The Earl rested his on the table. They spoke of nothing particular. The music she had been teaching, a passage in Mozart he had once played with his late wife, the weather of the next morning. And yet when the little girl came back with her book, and the housekeeper came in with the candles, and the spell of the long, soft twilight was broken at last, both of them rose from their chairs with the small, careful slowness of people who had not quite expected an evening to pass so easily. After that supper, things changed without changing, in the gentle way of country houses. The Earl began to take supper with them 3 evenings a week, then 4. Then, by the first week of July, every evening but Sunday, when he dined alone in the dining room out of long habit. The little girl was always with them. The morning room grew quietly accustomed to 3 places set at its small round table. He still passed the door of the morning room 3 times a week during lessons. He still, even now, did not come in. But the small, unspoken understanding between them had grown, in the way these things grow, into something that was felt rather than said. She knew his step. He knew her voice from the corridor. The gentle counting under her breath, the soft words of correction or praise to the little girl. The house knew them both. July eased into August. The roses turned heavier, deeper, faintly tired. The little girl learned a small Schubert piece, and then another, and then, at the young woman's suggestion, a slow, simple Haydn. The young woman wrote home to her father once a fortnight. Her father wrote back. The letters spoke of small things: the Wiltshire roses, the elder sister's first child expected at Michaelmas, the new curate at the parish, and the young woman read them in the soft eastern light of her sitting room and folded them carefully into the small drawer of her writing desk. It was at the end of the first week of August that she began to practice the Schubert Duet in secret. She had brought it with her in her trunk, tucked between the other music. It was a simple piece, a slow, tender andante in F major, the kind written for a teacher and a more advanced pupil, or for two friends, or for two people who had not yet found a name for what they were to one another. Her mother had played it once at the cottage piano in the Wiltshire parlor, with the young woman's father turning the pages on a summer evening when the young woman had been perhaps 6 years old and falling asleep in a wing-back chair beneath the window. She remembered the music more clearly than she remembered her mother's voice. She had carried it always. She practiced it in the late afternoons, after the little girl's lesson and before supper, when the Earl was out about the home farm and the morning room was empty and the door could be quietly closed. She played both parts in turn, the upper, then the lower, until her gloved hands knew the shape of the whole. She had no plan, exactly, for what she would do with it. She only knew that she wished to be ready. The little girl, of course, found her out. The little girl was 8, and clever, and missed very little. One afternoon, in the middle of August, she pushed the morning room door open by a quiet inch, watched her teacher play 4 bars of the lower part with great careful concentration, and shut the door again as silently as she had opened it. She did not speak of it. She went away upstairs to her schoolroom and sat at her small desk and looked out across the rose garden with her hazel eyes very thoughtful indeed, and a small, careful idea began at the back of her mind. Her 9th birthday fell on the last day of August. It was discussed at supper. The Earl proposed a small estate party. Only the vicar of the local parish and his wife, a few neighboring families, the housekeeper and butler permitted into the morning room for the cake, a small bowl of late summer roses on the table. The little girl agreed that this would be perfectly delightful. The young woman, asked her opinion, said it sounded lovely. She did not say what was beginning, very quietly, to gather in her own mind. She asked the little girl, after supper, whether she might wish to play a small piece for the assembled guests on her birthday. The little girl, very gravely, said yes. She had been practicing the robin in the garden and a short, slow Haydn minuet, and she thought she could manage them both. The young woman said she thought so too, and then, after a small, careful pause, she said in her quiet, steady voice that perhaps, if the little girl liked the idea, she herself might play one short piece afterwards for the company as a sort of thank you for the hospitality of the house. The little girl, looking up at her with grave hazel eyes, said, "Yes, that would be very fine." And then, after a pause of her own, she said, "Would it be the piece in the upstairs cupboard? The one with the dove-gray cover? The one her teacher had been practicing in the afternoons?" The young woman blushed faintly. She said yes, perhaps that one. The little girl nodded, very serious, and finished her bread and butter and asked to be excused. The end of August came in soft and gold. The morning of the little girl's birthday dawned with a faint mist across the rose garden that lifted by 10 and gave way to one of those still warm late summer days when the air smells of warm stone and last roses and the slow first hint of the coming autumn. The party gathered in the morning room at 4. The local vicar and his wife, 2 neighboring families with quiet children, an old great-aunt down from Oxford for the day. The little girl wore her best pale blue frock with a white sash and her 2 ribbons. The young woman wore her cream evening gown, the soft muslin one with short puffed sleeves and a modest scoop neckline edged with white lace, her cream silk gloves to the elbow, the small ivory cameo at her throat upon its fine ribbon. The Earl wore his dark charcoal coat over his cream waistcoat and his white cravat, his polished boots, his hair neatly brushed back. He greeted his guests at the door of the morning room one by one, gravely and gently, and shook each hand. There was tea. There was a small white cake with sugared violets upon it. The little girl received her presents, which were modest and country and kind. There was a soft, slow conversation about the harvest. By 6, the long shadows of the beeches had begun to reach across the south lawn. By 7, the guests had begun, one by one, to make their soft farewells. And by 7:30, the front gates had closed behind the last of them, and the morning room held only the Earl, the young woman, the little girl, the housekeeper bringing in fresh candles, and the lingering golden hush of a country evening that had been a long time coming. The Earl said gently to his daughter that he believed she had promised to play a piece. The little girl, very gravely, said she would. She went to the Broadwood. She lifted the fall. The candlelight, just lit, fell soft and warm across the polished walnut. She played the robin in the garden first, slowly, with great careful concentration, and then the little Haydn minuet, with 2 small mistakes that she corrected herself, and at the end she dropped her small hands into her lap and waited. The young woman, sitting in the wing-back chair by the fireplace, smiled at her with such gentleness that the Earl, watching them both, felt something in his chest turn over very softly and settle. When the small applause was over, the little girl looked across the room at her teacher. She did not speak. She only looked. The young woman rose, very slowly, from the wing-back chair and crossed the room to the Broadwood. The little girl slid down from the bench, curtsied neatly, and went, very deliberately, to the wing-back chair her teacher had just left, and curled herself into it with the gentle composure of a small cat. Her hazel eyes were very steady. The young woman sat down on the right end of the long, padded bench. She lifted the dove-gray music score from beneath the music rest where she had laid it that afternoon. She opened it to the first page of the Schubert Duet. She drew a single soft breath. She lifted her gloved hands to the upper octave keys. She began to play. The Andante in F major began very quietly, the way such pieces do, with a single long-held note in the upper part, and then a slow, tender turning of 3 further notes, and then the gentle entry of the lower part, which was the part she had not yet reached, because there was no one yet at her side to play it. She played the upper part as her mother had taught her. Slow, tender, unhurried, the way one tells a long-loved story to a child at bedtime, and the morning room held its breath about her. The candle flames stood very still. The Cotswold evening at the open window beyond the fortepiano was a deep, cool blue. The little girl in the wing-back chair did not move. Halfway through the 8th bar, she heard the soft sound of a footstep crossing the carpet behind her. She did not turn. She knew the step. The Earl came to the bench. He did not speak. He sat down at the left end. He placed his hands upon the lower octave keys very carefully, as a man places his hands upon something he had thought he should never touch again. The candle on the candelabrum just above the music rest flickered once and steadied. He came in upon his entry note exactly when he should. The first lower part chord of the Schubert Duet rose from beneath her line, deep and slow and tender, and folded itself in beneath her own, playing like a hand laid gently against a back. He had not played a note in 4 years. He played it as though no time at all had passed. Neither of them looked at the other. They looked only at the keys. The young woman's fingers were trembling very faintly inside their cream silk gloves. The Earl's were perfectly steady, with the steadiness of a man who has held himself together for a very long time, and is finally allowing himself, in this one slow, tender andante in F major, to set the weight down. They played the duet through to its end. It took perhaps 3.5 minutes. It felt to them both, afterwards, like it had taken an hour, or no time at all, or some quiet country measure of time that did not exist in any other place. The slow, turning melody of Schubert moved back and forth between her line and his, sometimes hers asking, sometimes his answering, sometimes both together in the soft chord changes, and the warm amber of the brass candelabrum lit his right cheekbone, and the cool blue of the late summer evening through the open window lit her left profile, and behind them, in the wing-back chair, the 8-year-old daughter, now 9 by an hour or two, sat very still with her hazel eyes shining, and sometime in the middle of the second page she had quietly fallen asleep, with one small white hand curled beneath her cheek. When the last chord came, very slow, very soft, in F major, they let it die away under their fingers together, with the same slow, unhurried lifting of the hand. The room held the silence that follows true music, that small, full silence that is not empty at all, but is itself a kind of sound. Outside the window, a single late thrush sang one phrase from the rose garden, and then was quiet. The young woman did not lift her eyes. She could not, for a moment. Her gloved hands rested upon the upper octave keys. She was aware, with an awareness that was not of the head but of the heart, that the Earl had not lifted his either, and that they were both, very carefully, not breathing. At length, she heard him draw, very softly, a single, slow breath. She drew one of her own. She lifted her gray-blue eyes, slowly, and turned her face to him. He was looking at her already. His gray-blue eyes were very full, very gentle, very still. Whatever had been closed in his face since the spring his wife had died, that small, careful door he had kept locked for 4 years, stood, in this candle-lit moment, open. He looked at her as a man looks at a room he has not entered for a long time, and finds, to his quiet astonishment, that the lamps are lit. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that would not be smaller than what had passed between them in the duet. She, for her part, looked back at him with her warm, gray-blue eyes lifted in the soft, stunned, tender realization of a young woman who has just understood something about the rest of her life. Her soft, full mouth was slightly parted. The single, pale blue silk ribbon at the nape of her neck had loosened by a fraction during the playing, and a single wave of honey-blonde hair had fallen against her cheek. The candlelight from the brass candelabrum lay across his stubbled jaw. The cool, autumn evening light fell across her bare collarbone above the white lace edge of her gown. Behind them, the little girl slept gently in the wing-back chair, with one small white hand curled beneath her cheek. The Earl spoke first, after what felt to both of them like a very long time. He said only, very softly, "Thank you." The young woman shook her head once, very faintly, smiling without quite knowing she was smiling. She said, almost in a whisper, "No, thank you." He nodded. He looked, for one further moment, at the keys beneath their hands, and then back at her, and he said, very quietly, that he had not known he could still do that. She said, equally quietly, that she had hoped, only hoped, that he might. He said, after a small, slow pause, that she had been very patient. She said, with a small flicker of her own slow smile, that she had had a very good Broadwood and a very kind 8-year-old conspirator. He looked at his sleeping daughter, and his mouth, at last, did the thing it had been almost doing for 3 months. It lifted at one corner, very slowly, into a real and unmistakable smile. And the morning room of Avenstone Park, on the soft, late summer evening of his daughter's 9th birthday, held the first true smile of the master of the house in 4 long, quiet years. Neither of them rose at once. They sat side by side on the padded bench, their hands gently lifted from the keys, and the forte piano cooled beneath their palms, and the candlelight steadied, and outside the window, the long Cotswold evening eased down at last into night. It was the housekeeper who came in a little later with a soft shawl for the sleeping child, and who saw what she saw and said nothing of it, only smiled to herself in the doorway, and went away to fetch fresh candles for the upstairs corridor. She had served the family since before the late Countess had died. She had not seen the master so still in his face for 4 years. The next morning, very early, before the housekeeper had laid the breakfast, and before the little girl had come down from the nursery, the young woman walked alone in the rose garden in her white shawl and her pale blue muslin day dress, and the Earl came out from the south door of the house, hatless, with his dark hair brushed back, in his shirt sleeves and a quiet morning waistcoat, for once without his coat, and he walked to her along the gravel path between the damask roses, and he stopped at the proper distance, and he asked her, with a courtesy that was now made more rather than less by what had passed the evening before, whether he might speak with her on a matter that he had been considering since the duet had ended. She said yes. He spoke to her then in the quiet, measured way that was his nature, but with a tenderness in it that he did not attempt to hide. He told her that he had not, in 4 years, expected to feel as he had felt the previous evening. He told her that he had never intended, when he had written her father's friend the letter requesting a teacher for his daughter, that he should come to feel anything at all toward the young woman who arrived. He told her, very carefully, that he was a widower of 35 years, with a child of 9, and a house of considerable size, and a quietness in his nature that some had called austere, and that he did not flatter himself that any of these things were a great gift to lay before a young woman of 23, whose life lay open before her. But he told her also, his gray blue eyes very steady, that if she could in time think kindly of him, he should consider himself the most fortunate man in the county. She listened to him with her gloved hands folded before her, and her honey blonde hair very neat in the morning light, and her warm, gray blue eyes lifted to his face. When he had finished, she did not answer at once. She let the soft, early sun lie on the roses for a long moment. Then she said quietly that she had thought kindly of him from very nearly the first week, that she had not known until the previous evening that her thinking had become something more than kindness, that if he wished her to remain at Avenstone Park as more than the teacher of his child, she would be very glad to remain, that she would write to her father that very morning. He bowed his head once, slowly, and when he lifted it again, his gray blue eyes were soft. He held out one hand, palm upward, in the formal Regency manner, and she set her gloved hand into it, and they stood there for one long moment in the rose garden, the early sun lifting itself over the beech avenue beyond, the dew still on the damask roses, the house behind them quiet, and the day before them very long and very gentle. He took her in to breakfast then. The little girl came down from the nursery in her pale blue ribbons and saw at once, with the clear, sharp eye of a child who has been conspiring for 3 months, that something had been quietly settled while she had still been asleep. She did not say so. She only sat down at her place, very upright, and looked once at her father and once at her teacher, and helped herself with great dignity to a piece of buttered toast. But under the table, in her small lap, her hands were folded together in a particular pleased way that meant, to anyone who knew her, which now included 2 adults sitting opposite her at the breakfast table, that her work was done. There remained the matter of the wedding. It was decided between the 3 of them in the soft, slow evenings of September that it should be very small. The young woman wrote to her father at the Wiltshire vicarage. Her father wrote back, his hand a little unsteady with quiet joy, that he would come, and that he would marry them himself if the local vicar of the Cotswold parish would permit it, which the local vicar, on being applied to with great courtesy, was very willing to do. The Earl wrote to the few relations he kept in regular correspondence with, a quiet aunt in Bath, a cousin in Gloucester, his late wife's brother, whom he had loved like his own. Each replied with kindness. The little girl was given the office of scattering rose petals and accepted it with great seriousness, going at once to the rose garden to make a small, careful selection of which roses would yield the best. The wedding day was set for the first Saturday in early winter, the very first Saturday of December, a date chosen because the late autumn rose hips would still be on the chapel walls, and a few of the pale climbers along the south wall of the chapel would still hold their last small white flowers. The local seamstress in the village made the young woman a wedding gown of soft cream silk. Very simple, high-waisted in the Regency fashion, with short puffed sleeves and a modest scoop neckline edged with white lace, almost a sister to the muslin evening gown she had worn on the night of the Duet, but heavier, softer, a gown for the morning of the rest of one's life. Her honey blonde hair was to be pinned up simply, with a single pale blue silk ribbon at the nape, in the way she had always worn it. The autumn came on around them in the slow, gentle Cotswold way. The beeches in the avenue turned from green to gold to a deep, soft amber, and dropped their leaves a little at a time, and the rose garden grew heavy with hips. The little girl turned from being 8½ to being 9¼ and grew an inch and learned a small, slow Mozart minuet, and asked her teacher, one afternoon in October, in her clear, unhurried voice, whether she might call her something other than Madam after the wedding. The young woman, in her gloved hand, against the child's small strawberry blonde head, said yes, that there were many gentle words she might choose from. The little girl considered them all very gravely, and finally chose one, and would not say which until the wedding morning itself. The Earl, for his part, played the Broadwood now. Not often, not loudly, but in the long, quiet hours of the autumn afternoons, with the rain running soft against the morning-room windows, he sometimes sat at the bench alone, or sometimes with the little girl beside him, and played slowly through the small pieces his late wife had taught him long ago. He played them differently now, gentler, slower, with a touch of forgiveness in his hand for the man who had not played them in so long. Twice in October, he played a piece for the young woman alone at the close of evening, with the candles lit and the curtains drawn. She sat in the wing-back chair and listened with her warm, gray-blue eyes very still upon his profile, and when the piece ended, neither of them spoke for a long moment. And then he smiled at her, and she smiled at him, and they went in to a quiet supper. The first Saturday of December dawned cold and pale gold. There had been a frost in the night across the rose garden, the first real frost of the winter, and the rose hips on the chapel walls were rimed with silver until the sun reached them at 8:30. The chapel itself, an old, small building of honey Cotswold stone at the edge of the village, was a 1/4 mile from the gates of Avenstone Park. It had been there in some form since the 12th century, The pale climbers along the south wall still held their last few small white flowers, and the rose hips along the porch were thick and red and bright. Inside, the small stone aisle had been swept. The old oak pews had been waxed. The brass candle sconces had been polished, and a small chapel pipe organ stood in its corner, low and modest, with a single carved bench before it. The young woman walked from the gates of Avenstone Park to the chapel that morning on her father's arm. She wore her cream silk wedding gown with the short puffed sleeves and the modest white lace neckline. Her cream silk gloves came to her elbow. The small ivory cameo at her throat sat upon its fine ribbon as it had sat on every important morning of her life. Her honey blonde hair was pinned up simply, with a single pale blue silk ribbon at the nape, and her father, in his old well-pressed black coat, his eyes a little bright, walked beside her along the lane between the bare beech hedges with the slow, proud step of a country vicar walking his middle daughter to her wedding. The little girl was already at the chapel. She had gone ahead with the housekeeper, in a soft, pale blue child's frock with a white sash and her 2 ribbons, carrying a small basket of pale rose petals. She stood at the chapel porch, very upright, very serious, with the basket at her hip, and when she saw her teacher coming up the lane on her father's arm, her hazel eyes lit, and she did not run. She only stood the straighter and waited with the dignity of a small bridesmaid of 9. Inside the chapel, the few invited guests had taken their places: the housekeeper, the butler, the 3 or 4 neighboring country families who had come to the birthday party in August, the quiet aunt from Bath, the cousin from Gloucester, the brother of the late countess, and at the far end of the small stone aisle, in a coat of dark charcoal over a cream silk waistcoat with a fresh white cravat, his polished boots steady upon the flagstones, his dark brown hair brushed back from his high forehead, the Earl waited. He was not at the altar. He was at the small chapel pipe organ. When his bride entered upon her father's arm at the chapel door, with the little girl walking before her scattering pale rose petals from the basket with great careful concentration, dropping them 1 or 2 or 3 at a time upon the old stone flags, the Earl, at the small organ in the corner, lifted his hands and played for her. He played the upper part of the Schubert Andante in F major. He played it alone. He played it slow and tender and unhurried, the way one tells a long-loved story to the woman who is walking up the aisle to be one's wife. The small chapel acoustics gave back his playing soft and warm. The young woman walked toward him along the stone aisle with her gloved hand resting upon her father's sleeve and her warm gray-blue eyes lifted to his profile at the organ. And the late autumn rose hips at the chapel windows glowed soft red in the cold, pale gold of the December morning, and the little girl, scattering petals before her, paused once at the foot of the altar to look back over her shoulder at her teacher, who would, in a quarter of an hour, be something more, and smiled at her with the slow, careful smile of a child who has known, in her own quiet way, exactly what she was about for 3 months. The Earl played the Schubert through to its closing chord. He let it die away beneath his hands. He rose from the organ bench. He came to the altar. The vicar, who was the bride's own father, and who was a country gentleman of 58, whose voice had not quite held steady that morning when he had pressed his daughter's gloved hand once at the chapel door, opened his small, worn prayer book and began. The wedding was very short and very gentle. The vows were exchanged in the soft, cool air of the small Cotswold chapel. The cream silk ring slipped upon her gloved finger, fitted as though it had been measured in advance, which it had been. The little girl, at the proper moment, stepped forward and presented to her teacher a small posy of the last white roses from the south wall of the chapel, and curtsied neatly and stepped back. There was a very small, soft round of applause, country and modest, from the few guests in the pews. When it was done, the Earl led his bride down the aisle on his arm, and the little girl walked behind them, scattering the last of her pale rose petals. And at the chapel door, they paused for one slow moment in the cold, pale December sun, with the rose hips bright behind them and the bare beech hedges along the lane shining faintly with the morning's frost. And the little girl, looking up at her teacher with her hazel eyes very serious indeed, said the word she had chosen. She said it quite quietly. The young woman heard it. The Earl heard it. None of the guests behind them quite heard it, and that was as it should be, for it was a small private offering from a small private heart. The young woman looked down at the little girl, and her warm, gray-blue eyes filled, and she did not let the tears fall. She had been brought up not to weep in doorways if she could help it. But she put her gloved hand very gently upon the small, strawberry blonde head, and she said, in her quiet, steady voice, that she should be very glad to be called that, for as long as the little girl wished to call her so. The little girl nodded once, gravely. Then she ran ahead, in the small, unhurried run of a 9-year-old in white silk slippers on a frosty morning, to scatter the very last of her pale rose petals along the lane home. The wedding breakfast was taken in the morning room of Avenstone Park, the same morning room with the dove-gray wallpaper and the marble fireplace and the gilt mirror and the polished walnut broadwood. There was cold ham again, and a fine raised pie, and a small white cake with sugared violets upon it, the sister cake of the one that had stood upon the same table on the little girl's 9th birthday. The few guests stayed an hour and were courteous and slipped away by midday in 2s and 3s, and by 3 o'clock the house held only its own household and its 3 quiet inhabitants. The light at the morning room window had begun to turn the soft pale gold of an early winter afternoon. The broadwood stood against the inner wall, polished and patient. The sheet music of the Schubert Duet lay open upon the music rest, where it had lain since the August evening of the duet, where it had been left upon return from the chapel that very morning by the housekeeper with a soft, careful hand. The Earl, in his charcoal coat and cream waistcoat, looked across the morning room at his bride, who was no longer his bride, technically, but his wife, by the proper word of the prayer book read aloud in the chapel that morning, and he held out his hand. She crossed the room to him in her soft cream silk gown. She set her gloved hand into his. He led her, very simply, to the long padded bench of the broadwood. He sat down at the left end. She sat down at the right end. The little girl, who had been watching from the wing-back chair with her hazel eyes shining, did not stir. She knew what was coming. She had, in her own quiet way, been waiting for it since early August. He lifted his hands to the lower octave keys. She lifted her gloved hands to the upper. The Cotswold afternoon outside the morning room window was cold and pale and gold. The candles had not yet been lit. The fire upon the marble hearth made a soft, slow, low, warm sound at the edges of the room. They began to play the Schubert Andante in F major. They played it through, slow and tender, the upper line and the lower line folding into one another in the way they had folded in August, but easier now, gentler now, with the small, careful steadiness of 2 people who had learned, over the slow autumn between, that the duet did not need to be afraid of itself. The little girl in the wing-back chair watched them with her hazel eyes very still. Halfway through, in the soft second page, she laid her cheek upon the velvet arm of the chair, and her eyelids grew heavy, and by the closing chord, she had drifted gently asleep in the warm, slow afternoon, with one small white hand curled beneath her cheek, just as she had drifted asleep on the August evening that had begun all of this. When the last chord came, very slow, very soft, in F major. The young woman, the new young Countess of Avenstone, though she would be a long time getting used to being called that, let it die away beneath her gloved fingers, and she lifted her warm, gray-blue eyes to her husband's profile. And he lifted his to hers, and they sat side by side at the long, padded bench of the polished walnut broadwood, with the soft pale gold of the early winter afternoon falling across them. And they were neither of them, for one long, quiet moment, breathing. Then he smiled at her. The slow, real, unmistakable smile he had given her first on the August evening of the duet. The smile that had been, in his own house, a kind of returning. She smiled at him, the slow, tender smile she had not quite known she had been keeping for him until the morning he had walked toward her down the gravel path between the damask roses. The little girl in the wing-back chair slept gently. The fire upon the marble hearth made its low, warm sound. Outside the window, a single late thrush, who had not yet quite understood that the year was turning, sang one phrase from somewhere in the bare rose garden, and then was quiet. And somewhere, perhaps in a small drawer of the writing desk in her sitting room in the east wing, or perhaps in the dove-gray music score, now resting upon the music rest of the broadwood, or perhaps only in the slow, soft hush of the morning room itself. The long, quiet story of 3 small lives that had been altered over one Cotswold spring and summer and autumn and the very edge of one early winter, without ever once raising its voice, settled itself gently down to sleep. Outside, in the rose garden, the last of the rose hips glowed faintly red against the soft pale gold of the December afternoon. The beeches in the avenue stood bare and patient. The chapel down the lane held its memory of the morning's vows in its old stone walls. The house at Avenstone Park held within it 3 quiet hearts, and one polished walnut broadwood, and a single dove-gray music score open upon its rest, and the soft, slow afterglow of a Schubert duet only just played for the second time, and the long, gentle Cotswold winter to come. And the day eased very softly toward its evening.